Welcome, everyone. This is Laura Podolsky with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Just so everyone knows they're in the right place, this webinar is Actual Results May Vary, a behavioral review of eco-driving for policymakers. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation and the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at UC Davis. As some background, the National Center is one of 5 national centers designated by the U.S. Department of Transportation as part of their University Transportation Centers program. Our mission is to advance a more sustainable transportation system through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. Our consortium is being led by the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis in partnership with University of California at Riverside, University of Southern California, California State University at Long Beach, University of Vermont, and Georgia Tech. Today's webinar is part of a rollout of a white paper from the National Center authored by our speakers today. The white paper is posted as of yesterday on the National Center's webpage, and we will be sending a link so you can download that paper after today's webinar. So for today's webinar, we will be spending the first half hearing from our speakers, and the second half we're dedicating to hear from all of you. So we hope you came with questions today. As you can probably tell, everyone is on mute. So if you hear any distracting, obnoxious sounds, that would be coming from us, the speakers, so you know who to blame. So if you do have any questions, we encourage you to type those into the chat box, and that is located in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. You could also use this chat box to let us know if you're running into any problems, and we're going to do our best to help you. Finally, we will be recording this webinar and posting it on our event page for later viewing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Ken Kurani is an associate researcher at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. He is developing approaches and methods to evaluate user responses to new transportation and information technologies. His ongoing research includes the role of energy efficiency and air quality in household travel choices, continued work on household response to electric and hybrid electric vehicles, and the impact of travel on sensitive environments. We're also joined by Dr. Angela Sanguinetti, who is an environmental psychologist and board-certified behavior analyst. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Her current areas of research include eco-driving adoption of smart home technology, energy feedback interfaces, and co-housing as a sustainable form of residential development. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to turn it over to our 2 speakers today.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everyone. This is Ken Kurani, and as Laura has introduced, I'm here with my colleague and co-author, Dr. Angela Sanguinetti. I'd also like to note the help we've had from a graduate student, Hannah Park, in developing this review that we'll be talking about today, and in some of the graphics we'll be using, Sahelia Sikand has been immensely helpful. The title, of course, is taken from the line off the Monroney sticker that's on every new car sold in the U.S., indicating to buyers of new vehicles that the results they get may vary from the official EPA rating on the side, on the sticker on the vehicle. Our interest was to explore whether that variability can be harnessed usefully to meet policy goals. So as part of this conversation today, we're going to move through a series of questions which are the framing questions for the paper itself. So why would we be interested in eco-driving? Why would we be interested in trying to capture this variability in driver behavior? What are eco-driving behaviors? How much might they save if we're talking about fuel savings? How much might they reduce emissions if we're talking about emissions reductions? And how is eco-driving, or more generally, how are eco-driving behaviors promoted? And for this audience in particular today, a 5th question, which I'm hoping will be a big part of the discussion at the end, is what is a policymaker to do about anything we have to say in our review of the recent and previous literature. So with that framing, we'll get into the questions. So why eco-driving? Well, there's a wide variety of social goals. Of course, the fuel economy standards, corporate average fuel economy standards for motor vehicles have their roots in the energy shortages, the petroleum price rises of the 1970s. But of course, they're also linked to emissions goals, whether that's emissions of criteria pollutants, clean air standards, those sorts of things, and more recently, climate goals, which can affect local attainment plans. So lots of local metropolitan planning organizations have looked at things like eco-driving as whether those are valid elements of local plans to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Also, whether or not driver behavior can be counted in the zero-emission vehicle credits that are assigned to electric drive vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, those sorts of things. And safety has also been tied to eco-driving, whether that is eco-driving can productively be tied to safety goals, or whether there might also be competing, conflicting interests. In particular, this comes up in conversations about what is known as hypermiling and whether certain hypermiling behaviors might be contradictory to safety goals. For private individuals, of course, there's the possible interest in fuel cost savings. Is it possible for their behavior to make such a difference that they would actually see this behavior show up as a reduction in their private fuel bill? If we can show that eco-driving behaviors do lead to reductions in accidents, there's certainly a reduction of private cost of accidents. We also hear in other research of our own here over the years, mostly around electric drive vehicles and hybrids, the role of eco-driving behaviors and the use of feedback in vehicles as part of self-identity formation about what kinds of vehicles people buy, whether they see themselves as economical drivers or environmentally conscious drivers. So there are a number of also private goals that eco-driving behaviors may further. So that's a quick roundup of why eco-driving. Let's get into what we think eco-driving behaviors are. And the first thing to know about the literature is that it's varied, even more varied than the possible behaviors and the effect of the behaviors on fuel economy performance. We see differences in whose behavior is being studied. Probably most frequently it's the driver of the vehicle, but several studies expand the definition of eco-driving to ownership behaviors, such as vehicle maintenance, and that vehicle maintenance might be things people are expected to do weekly or monthly, like check tire inflations, to things that are quarterly or semi-annually, like oil changes and engine tune-ups. Other authors even expand the definition to buyer behavior, so they're going all the way back to which vehicles people buy. We may also be talking about whether or not it's the driver's behavior at all or a passenger's behavior, or whether the passenger affects the driver's behavior. So a passenger may be using, for example, onboard auxiliary electronics or the heating and air conditioning. The driver may feel subject to various time pressures imposed not by the driver's schedule but by a passenger's schedule. There are also differences to whether or not, if particularly we expand the definition of eco-driving beyond just driving behaviors to ownership and purchase behaviors, then are we talking about a professional, like a mechanic? And what's the relationship between the driver and the passenger and other people who may themselves, either, again, directly through the driver's scheduling or the passengers, whether that's a parent, a partner, or a pal, as to what the nature of the effects on driving behavior, owning behavior, and buying behavior might be. There's also a lack of consistency even within behavior. So even if we narrow it all the way down to a driving behavior like accelerating, the literature gives various advice as to whether one should accelerate slowly, moderately, or quickly. Rarely do we see a comprehensive definition. So even if someone expands the definition of driving behaviors or eco-driving behaviors from driving to ownership to purchase, rarely are they comprehensive across all of those categories. So that, for example, ownership behaviors might not include both engine maintenance and tire pressure. We also see an absence of attention to being comprehensive across context, and maybe the most straightforward example of this would be the difference between vehicles that are powered solely by an internal combustion engine and hybrid drivetrains. Are the advices that we would give to someone driving a vehicle powered only by an internal combustion engine the same as we would give to the driver of a hybrid, or are the eco-driving behaviors different between those two types of vehicles? Lastly, we see a lack of precision, particularly in the report, in the literature itself, as to how well things are described and how precisely they're described, so that we don't know what slow, moderate, or quick acceleration means and compared to what. Faced with all of this, the first thing we did was to try to come up with a classification scheme for what are driving behaviors. And that takes us to the next slide. We have a couple of frameworks in the paper, and this talk today will focus only on the one we sort of really deployed the most in the paper, which is a behavior analytic approach, which is to take a step back, and before we ask what are eco-driving behaviors, ask the question, what is behavior? And the approach is a behavior analytic approach, in which behavior is defined by its function, its topography, and its context. Function is the effect of the behavior. What does it do? Topography is the observable form of the behavior. What does it look like? And context is who is emitting the behavior, when, and where. By and large, we had thought we would focus on defining eco-driving behaviors that are specifically excluded by the CAFE standard setting process. So the official fuel economy estimate for vehicles is established on a chassis dynamometer. There's no driver in the vehicle. The vehicle's put through a computer-controlled driving sequence, and a fuel economy estimate is output. Our question then becomes, what happens when we put the driver in the vehicle, and what are all the behaviors that are inside of that phrase, results may vary? We'll take this behavior analytic approach of topography, function, and context, and in the next table, in the next slide, we'll start to develop a table which appears in full in the paper as to defining these driving behaviors in relationship to a much broader set of behaviors we see defined as eco-driving in the literature. So to make that a little more clear, let's start with the table and understand that the categories listed on the right are actually the output of the analytical review. So these are the categories that result from our review of the literature. We have our driving behaviors at the top, but other behaviors that we ultimately classified as cabin comfort, trip planning, load management, fueling, and maintenance behaviors. So we start with driving, its topography. What is it? And we can break it down to, well, driving is accelerating, cruising, decelerating, waiting, parking. Waiting and parking have a lot to do with idling. And we do the same thing with all of the other categories of behavior. So the cabin comfort is about using the heating, ventilation down, using auxiliary electronics, so on and so forth for the other categories of behavior, trip planning, load management, fueling, and maintenance. We can also then start to talk about the function and context of each of these. So the function of driving is to operate the vehicle. It's pretty straightforward. The context is more complicated, but it is the driver, en route, in vehicle. So we're assuming a vehicle, we're assuming a trip is being taken. What can the driver do in that context to affect the energy and emissions outcomes? And again, without reading the full table to you, it's available in the paper. this, in effect, is how we get back to those columns on the left-hand side, the categories, is by, in effect, describing the behaviors according to the topography, function, and context. Now, all of this was important as a lead into our third question, at which point I'll hand this conversation over to Dr. Sanguinetti, because if we're going to answer the next question, which is how much can eco-driving save, we have to know which behaviors are we talking about. So, Angela.
Hello, everyone. So, as Dr. Kurani mentioned, now that we've discussed what eco-driving is and we know a little bit more about what those behaviors are, we'll move into a discussion of the current state of knowledge regarding the savings potential of eco-driving. So to frame this discussion, we consider an equation developed by environmental psychologist Paul Stern. Stern suggests that for any action that can mitigate climate change, the overall impact is a function of the technical potential for savings and the number of people that adopt the behavior. Applying each term in this equation to eco-driving, first we have I for impact. In the context of eco-driving, impact can be considered savings in terms of both fuel economy and improvements and emissions reductions. Technical potential, T, is the savings achieved by eco-driving per driver. The next term, P, is behavioral plasticity, which is the proportion of drivers that can be induced to adopt eco-driving. And finally, N is the total population that could possibly enact eco-driving. So in sum, the total savings potential of eco-driving is equal to the savings per driver multiplied by the number of drivers who do it. Pretty straightforward. However, it does get a bit more complicated. So we just heard about the multitude of diverse behaviors that constitute eco-driving. The technical potential of each of those behaviors can be summed up, and that's easy enough for total savings, but each behavior is going to have a different level of behavioral plasticity. For example, one study suggests that turning off the engine rather than idling could have greater plasticity. That is, it was more widely adopted by the study participants compared to other eco-driving behaviors like moderating speed and acceleration. So we can't really solve the equation until we know not only both the technical potential of eco-driving and behavioral plasticity, but we need to know both of these terms for each eco-driving behavior, K, in the equation, or perhaps at least for our 6 categories, driving, cabin comfort, maintenance, etc., which we hypothesized as being distinct in meaningful ways that have implications for behavioral plasticity. So I'm going to discuss 2 sources that we relied upon heavily when trying to solve for impact of eco-driving. One source we found really useful toward building an understanding of the technical potential for savings is a paper published in Transport Policy a few years ago. The authors, Sivak and Schottel, considered a number of eco-driving behaviors, including behaviors in 5 out of our 6 behavior categories. And this level of comprehensiveness was unique among the research we reviewed. As Dr. Kurani mentioned, most accounts of eco-driving are not comprehensive. They take one behavior from one category and several from another, which is one reason why this particular paper was so valuable for us, because it was more comprehensive than most other accounts of eco-driving. And Sivak and Schottel reviewed vehicle testing studies in which the vehicle is the subject of the research, not actual drivers, meaning that the research directly manipulated vehicle conditions and operations and measured fuel economy outcomes rather than intervening upon actual drivers to change their behavior. So we don't get any information from this about behavioral plasticity, the degree to which drivers would adopt the various behaviors, but it is a powerful source for showing just how much behavioral factors contribute to fuel economy outcomes. The authors concluded that the driver of a vehicle rated 36 miles per gallon can decrease their fuel economy by 45% if they were to disregard all eco-driving behaviors. Now, this doesn't translate to the converse, that adopting all eco-driving behaviors would lead to 45% technical potential of savings, and more on that in a minute. Sivak and Schottel also suggest some prioritization of the behaviors that might be most influential, and this is another reason their review is valuable. At the top of their list are behaviors corresponding to our category of driving behavior. Specifically, they talk about aggressive driving, which is a rubric that kind of lumps together a number of different driving behaviors, which we talk about more in our paper, and speed. So those are what they rank as sort of being most important out of all the behaviors in our definition of eco-driving. Unfortunately, these estimates by Civic and Schottel have some limitations when taken as evidence of the technical potential of eco-driving, because in their modeling, they compared eco-driving to behaviors to baselines that may not be representative of average drivers. And they did this intentionally as they seemed more interested in the maximum variation in fuel economy rather than the average savings associated with eco-driving. So for example, they started off with a vehicle rated at 36 miles per gallon, and that's what all their estimates are based upon. That's not the average miles per gallon of all the vehicles out there. They also assume aggressive driving, so they compare eco-driving to aggressive driving, and they assume somewhat extreme opportunities to reduce speed. Specifically, they calculate the difference between driving at 90 miles per hour for 20% of the time, which is hopefully rare among the population of drivers, compared to only 60 miles per hour. So the true technical potential for savings, conceptualized as the average savings per driver, is not as high as 45%. However, we did identify a number of eco-driving behaviors that Civic and Schottel did not consider, so that brings the potential back up a bit more. So looking for an estimate of savings potential that accounts for that behavioral plasticity, we can refer to the ample human subjects research on eco-driving that's out there. And almost all of this research focuses only on eco-driving behaviors that we categorized as driving behaviors, with a couple focusing on eco-routing, which we categorized in our category of trip planning. So we reviewed 40 human subject studies, either field or lab studies that targeted driving behavior to promote eco-driving behavior. And the average effect among those studies was a 9% improvement in fuel economy. This average was calculated from the studies among those 40 that measured fuel economy, which was 32 of them. And fuel economy was the most common outcome measure, more common than measuring emissions outcomes or directly measuring behavior outcomes of eco-driving behavior. When actual driving behavior was measured, the most common targets were accelerating, cruising, and decelerating, according to how we define the behaviors. And these are essentially the same behaviors emphasized by Civic and Schottel when they talk about aggressivity and speed. This 9% estimate incorporates behavioral plasticity, but it only accounts for one category of eco-driving behavior, driving. So the actual impact of all eco-driving, all those 6 categories we mentioned, is likely considerably higher than that 9%. Because many studies didn't measure behavior directly, and those that did had inconsistent operational definitions, we can't easily match or map the savings outcomes and levels of plasticity onto particular behaviors. So with regard to our question, how much can eco-driving save, we could be confident saying it's more than 9% and also that it's less than 45%. We don't feel comfortable trying to be too much more precise than that, given the limitations and current knowledge that we've just discussed. We do, however, have some suggestions for how to achieve better savings estimates. First off, whenever a study attempts to change driving behavior, it should measure driving behavior. Only 24 out of the 40 studies that promoted eco-driving actually measured driving behavior. Next, when assessing the technical potential of a given eco-driving behavior, one should use empirical data to articulate a baseline that's representative of the population of interest, so you can actually derive a true technical potential or a close approximation of technical potential for savings. And most importantly, there needs to be movement toward agreed upon definitions and measurement standards for eco-driving behaviors so that all these studies can start to be compared and reliable findings generated. Finally, some research has suggested that traffic network level effects of eco-driving can negate individual savings. For example, if drivers were to decrease their rate of acceleration through an intersection, fewer cars may move through the intersection at each light, and therefore there's more cars on the road longer, more idling, etc. So there needs to be more research to address this. So now we can confidently say that eco-driving is worth promoting. There's enough evidence for that, certainly. So how do we promote eco-driving? As I mentioned before, most of the human subjects research on eco-driving targets only those behaviors we categorized as driving behaviors. So again, with those 40 studies that we reviewed, we also looked at the strategies that they use to promote eco-driving. And the predominant strategy is in-vehicle feedback, followed by some sort of training. And we focused on trying to understand eco-driving feedback interventions, what makes them effective. Among the 27 feedback studies that we reviewed, the average effect was about 6% improvement in fuel economy, but effects were widely variable. Some of this variation is undoubtedly due to the fact that the feedback that was employed in the studies varied widely. Most of the studies of eco-driving feedback only tested one type of feedback compared to nothing, which, when effective, has shown the general promise of feedback, but it doesn't enable any kind of analysis of what makes feedback effective, for whom and for which behaviors and what contexts. But there have been a handful of comparative studies that start to get at features of feedback that make it more or less effective. And these studies suggest that eco-driving feedback is more effective when it aligns with the driver's goals. For example, feedback framed in terms of money spent or money saved would align with the driver's goal to save money. Also, feedback is more effective if it is adaptive to driver performance, so it starts out easier and then it becomes more challenging. Other influential factors suggested in the research are the specificity of the feedback. For example, it's important to think about whether you're targeting specific behaviors, and feedback is reflecting specific behaviors like accelerating, cruising, braking, or if the feedback is going to reflect an aggregate of behaviors. For example, anything that affects your mileage could be reflected in a display of instantaneous or average mileage. So AC use, tire inflation, and driving behavior could all be reflected in an instantaneous mileage indicator. And then the mode of interface of the feedback also has implications for effectiveness and safety, with one study showing that haptic feedback, that's counter pressure on the accelerator pedal, actually increased forward attention to the road, whereas visual feedback could be distracting. And there's other accounts that it's not distracting, but that's to be determined and requires more research. So each of those findings I just reviewed, however, was only in a single study. So they're far from reliable, yet there needs to be replication to substantiate those claims. And although vehicle manufacturers doubtless have their own in-house research on their own feedback systems, that research is not publicly available, and the academic literature virtually never tests feedback systems that are currently being deployed in vehicles by manufacturers. More importantly, eco-driving feedback studies are largely devoid of behavioral theory when it comes to both the design of the feedback and the research design. So those are some limitations of the feedback studies we reviewed. So as with our review of savings potential, we conclude that feedback is indeed a promising strategy to promote eco-driving, but we need more research from a behavioral perspective to know more and exactly how effective it can be. And specifically, we have some recommendations. We recommend that a quantitative meta-analysis be performed of the existing literature to try to statistically derive some of the key mediating and moderating variables that influence feedback effectiveness. And then another key direction is a research program that conceptually and empirically assesses different types of feedback based on the behaviors that they target and other behaviorally relevant features. And then feedback types could then be compared based on how well they influence specific behaviors for particular populations and in particular contexts. And now for our final discussion, which will hopefully generate some discussion with the audience as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Kurani, who's going to talk about policy implications.
Thank you, Angela. So I did want to start this sort of this part of the discussion section of this talk by pointing out we didn't pick CAFE just as a straw proposal. That the CAFE serves a very useful function. This idea of a standardized test in which variability is reduced because we have certain goals, which standardized testing better serves. But the results then get used in contexts outside of those original goals. So we see CAFE and CAFE targets, future CAFE targets, being used as goals for future energy simulations. Even as new types of vehicles are being introduced into the fleet, again, this comes back probably most specifically to, to electric drive and hybrid vehicles, and the idea that it may be very important to understand whether the same eco-driving advice applies across the different driving contexts represented by different types of vehicles. I think one of the key takeaways for all of us is that we need to be careful of the promises of energy and emissions outcomes of eco-driving generally and even driver feedback specifically. We've given you a pretty broad range, and if there's been probably the most frequent question to come back to us from reviewers is, well, what really is the range of effects here? And if we're unwilling to narrow it down from a 9% improvement to something more than that, it's because the literature itself doesn't support any more precise conclusion than that. The most important conclusion from the literature is this varies a lot. And it varies a lot by what kinds of behaviors have been studied, how many of those behaviors have been studied, is K greater than 1 in any of the studies, who is the population who can enact a behavior, how many will take up the behavior. So eco-routing, which we haven't talked about a lot today, the population isn't all drivers because not all vehicles have the feedback and navigation systems in them required for eco-routing advice. So we're already talking about a subset of the vehicles on the road. That will change over time as feedback and navigation systems become more common in new vehicles over time. And then again, of that increasing population, how many of the people who actually can follow eco-routing advice, how many do so? And then Angela touched on a point right at the end of there about the distribution of outcomes. So the literature focuses heavily on reporting average outcomes and mean outcomes. And of course, this implies a distribution of responses to each of these eco-driving promotions with respect to each of the eco-driving behaviors. And understanding that variability of response indicates that it is actually while in general we stand by the advice of it's probably better to do something than nothing when it comes to eco-driving, it is possible to screw it up and make people do worse. And understanding the conditions under which that happens will be important so that we are certain to be having a positive effect. Which I think also means, the last point I've put up here, which is to also be hopeful of the promises of energy and emissions outcomes, because it does seem clear, despite the variability and despite the uncertainty, it does seem clear that eco-driving can have positive effects on energy and emissions outcomes. And that with the results of the sort of research agenda that Angela's outlined, we can offer more precise information to drivers, owners, and buyers of vehicles, and more precise support to policymakers who are trying to help those drivers, owners, and buyers enact eco-driving behaviors. And my screen has actually gone to sleep, so I don't know if it means for the viewers.
No.
The viewers are fine. Okay.
The viewers are fine.
Okay. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions. Any questions regarding the presentation so far? And then any thoughts on this final slide on what do we think this all means, and what do any of you want to see going forward, either as part of an eco-driving research agenda or the actual deployment of an eco-driving program.
Great, thank you, Ken and Angela. We do have one question from the audience right now that pertains to this slide that we're on, is to provide a reminder on what K is greater than 1 and what does the K represent?
So K is an indicator we added to Paul Stern's original equation on impacts. So the original equation was I equals TPN, where I was impact, T was technical potential. And since my screen has been restored to me, let me just go back to that equation. Okay, so here's Paul Stern's original equation. The K is the indicator we added to show that, in fact, this equation has to be summed over K eco-driving behaviors. So where K is 1 to N, and we're not quite sure how big N is, but N depends on what are the boundaries of your definition of eco-driving, so that for us, if we go back to our categories of eco-driving behaviors, within each category listed on the left, we then have various topographies described in the next category, and we might have indicators for everything in the topographical category for as many of the, in the topographical column, for as many of the categories as we happen to be studying. So K is the count of the number of eco-driving behaviors to which you are paying attention.
Great. And another question also came in, and I believe it was the slide, Angela, that you were speaking to. Here, I'll try to toggle to it. I believe it's this one right here, and talking about this research, where what is the reason for using accident rather than the more accurate word collision?
Yeah, that wasn't in my slide, but I can speak to it anyway. There's no good reason. Collision would have been more precise.
All right, that was a quick response. We have another question from one of our participants. So in the 70s, during the Nixon administration, the speed limit was lowered to 55 miles per hour to save fuel. And if either of you want to comment on, is that an opportunity? Do we want to go back to that? Why don't we do that now?
I would say that's an excellent question for the policymakers. I mean, that's a policy decision on whether to do that or not. Certainly, the research on the effects of top speeds indicates that reducing the long tail of very high speeds would be very important. So in fact, it's very important to get the people who are doing more than 80 to slow down. It's also, and it's important both for energy and safety reasons. Whether or not getting everyone to slow down to 55, I mean, another way to ask the question is 55 the right number? We could rephrase the question as, what's the best top speed for highway driving for energy outcomes, and then talk about how do we get to some approximation of that speed. But why not 55? That's a policymaker's question.
Great. We do have another question that has come in, and if either of you can expand on this connection between eco-driving and zero-emission vehicle credits specifically.
Zero-emission vehicle credits can be tied to, so zero-emission vehicle credits are assigned not only to electric vehicles, which are all electric, they're also assigned to technologies that support the development of zero-emission vehicles. So plug-in hybrid vehicles and even hybrid vehicles may be assigned partial credits. And the amounts of those credits have to do with the energy performance of those vehicles. If the energy and emissions performances of those vehicles can be shown to be systematically improved, if those vehicles include energy feedback to drivers, for example, the question is, will the car manufacturers want that to be reflected in the credits they get for the vehicles? So you could imagine two different plug-in hybrid vehicles. one that actually gets a longer electric range than another, but the one with the shorter electric range has better energy instrumentation in it. The manufacturer of that vehicle might claim that on road and in practice, their vehicle with the shorter range actually does as well on energy and emissions as does the longer electric range vehicle, and therefore want a similar ZEV credit.
Great.
In some sense, the question is, how much do we really want to hardwire this variability in behavior into other regulations and policy? Do we want to count on an improvement in on-road performance through changing driver behavior to the extent that we're going to count it the same as we would a change in the technology of the vehicle, of the drivetrain itself?
So some other questions that we are getting in is to ask either of you to talk about the effectiveness of various real-time feedback. And I know you expanded upon this in your white paper, so I encourage everyone to go and download that. But for the time being, looks like Angela?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So that's an excellent question, one that I'm very interested in. As I mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of studies that compare multiple types of feedback, so I haven't seen any empirical evidence. The example you give, current MPG, I assume in like a numeric indicator versus a green or red light, more of an ambient indicator. So without the empirical evidence to back me up, based on behavioral theory, current MPG, a numeric indicator, would be more sensitive to behavior. It changes more, so it picks up more of the variation in behavior, and that can be beneficial to support learning. But on the other hand, the green or red light has the potential to be ambient if people can perceive it in their periphery. They don't have to actively look at the feedback. So for that reason, that could be better. So there really needs to be more systematic research here, and we're working on some other research that gets at working on categorizing the types of feedback that are out there so that we can then compare them and answer questions like that.
Great. And curious too, so there is this other research that you're doing that's going on, Angela. So when is that research, or where is that research in progress? Or
we're close to submission of a paper to probably energy policy or transport policy, articulating a typology of feedback.
Fabulous. So we have more coming in. This is great. So are there technical potentials and plasticities independent? Can we measure these various behaviors independently or sum them up collectively?
They're not independent. They are independent. So you need to know the plasticity associated with each behavior so you can then multiply that by the technical potential of that same behavior, and then you sum up all those relationships, if that makes sense. So they are independent.
Great. And here's another great one to expand upon. So in your opinion, is the value of idle reduction among the eco-driving behaviors, what is the value of that, I guess, as far as that full spectrum of different behaviors that a driver can be choosing from?
The only empirical study I recall that kind of gets at this is the one I cited earlier that had some implications for behavioral plasticity, that people may be, based on one study, people may be more apt to reduce their idling compared to changing other behaviors like their acceleration patterns and their cruising speed. But that particular study didn't parse out the contribution of idling to the overall fuel economy outcomes compared to the other behaviors that were targeted in the study. So I don't know. Do you?
So this one goes back to the effectiveness of different feedback. So in the literature, did you see anything about real-time feedback for audio feedbacks, beeping, or any other sounds I'm not sure that a car can make?
I've seen
chirping.
Yeah, I've seen one study on, it was about an app called Driving Miss Daisy, where Miss Daisy would talk to you from your phone and tell you to slow down and things like that. That's the only thing I've seen in terms of audio feedback. in our paper, we compare possibilities for feedback to the beeping seatbelt indicator light, but we haven't seen anything like that in terms of in-vehicle feedback.
So it sounds like a business opportunity, maybe. I never even heard of this app. I'll repeat. So Driving Miss Daisy. So
Yeah, I don't even know if it's commercially available.
Oh, okay. So we have another one. So when gasoline prices spiked a few years ago, people seemed to be responding to that and maybe changing their behavior. So did you see any studies conducted in this time frame? Did that spike in gasoline prices affect driving behavior in the manner of adopting eco-driving practices?
Is that question? Yeah,
with eco-driving
it's really hard to recall the publication dates of the studies, and the publication dates aren't necessarily that indicative of when the study was actually conducted, so I don't know. And there were no explicit conclusions drawn about that in any study. Most of the studies are very focused on just deploying one strategy and then testing it in a very short time period.
We have another question. We've labeled it here as question 4, where we're at in this room where we're conducting the webinar. So we have a question from the audience. They're saying we're working to develop a personalized mile per gallon estimate based on individualized drive cycle data as measured by onboard diagnostic devices. Is there the potential to develop personalized eco-driving tips based on individualized onboard diagnostic devices?
Yes, I think so. I think I've seen that in other apps. I've seen that in apps that try to learn the driver behavior and then give personalized tips. I don't remember any names, and again, they may not be available on any app stores. They might have just been developed and tested in one single empirical study. But I would say yes.
Yeah, I would extend that, the idea of individualized eco-driving tips, that in the few studies that have compared feedback types, that different drivers respond differently to different types of feedback, and if possible, in addition to tips, it would be useful if we could also personalize the actual feedback modalities to drivers based on data that could be derived from the individualized OBD data, and then possibly also a brief set of questions that the drivers themselves might answer. But yes, the idea of I think individualizing the tips both to drivers and using the OBD data opens up the possibility also to specializing the eco-driving advice across driving contexts, even for that driver-vehicle combination, so that as vehicle operations change according to traffic levels or speed levels. At the very beginning, we talked about the differences in advice regarding accelerating, whether you should accelerate slowly, moderately, or quickly. That advice might change for the same driver-vehicle combination depending on context, and being able to tell the driver, in the here and now, here's the optimal look-ahead tip on acceleration even, would be something that OBD data could start to inform. So yeah, there's a lot that could be done here.
So we have another participant that has shared that Canada might be in the lead here. So they've incorporated eco-driving into their driver training, and this is going on, I guess, for some time. So what are the opportunities for the U.S. or perhaps California to do the same? Any comments, insights? Any policymakers on the line that want to?
No, exactly. I would let the policymakers talk about that. Or not.
Yeah, and this has come up in our last webinar too on freight, where is this a huge opportunity to start instituting some of these eco-driving tips, is actually incorporating it into the driver training. And though we are not policymakers, I would say that this seems like a good opportunity to be taking advantage of. So Canada, thank you for showing us the way here. So our other question is expanding on the impact of eco-driving at the traffic level, the patterns and congestion. So this seems like an important thing to pause on and reflect on. So can either of you talk more about that?
I think an excellent source is a paper published last year in Transport Policy by Allen and McNabala, and they're the ones that they did a review of eco-driving driving behavior impacts and eco-routing impacts, and they're the ones that really pointed out this potential. The research that's been done so far on network-level impacts of both eco-routing and eco-driving is, I think, all based on analytical modeling, not actual real-world traffic scenarios, but modeling of what could happen if everyone did X, Y, and Z. But definitely check that out, Allen and McNabala, and it's cited in our paper and one of these slides as well.
Great. So here's another question, further talking about how do we incorporate eco-driving into driver training. So this one was on any other states that have actually looked at this. I'm not aware of them personally, just learned about Canada. So does Ken or Angela, do either of you know, or is that?
No, I'm not
that would be,
of any state
okay.
Explicitly including
Great.
driving.
Good question. I mean, it would be great to be looking at others and who are the leaders up front on this. So our next question is if either of you can talk about eco-driving and trucking. I know this paper was focused on light-duty vehicles. Mm-hmm. And we do have a white paper that is posted on eco-driving for trucking, so that should shed some light on that. But do either of you want to comment on that or have looked at that specifically? I'm sure a lot of these same things apply to trucking, but I don't know if you have any other insights in particular.
No, just that if the person with this question would contact us via email, we can give some citations of research that's been done in this area, but it sounds like also this white paper would be good.
Great, and we can send that out in the follow-up email. I'll just put links. We also we have an eco-driving paper for trucks, and again, it's trying to accomplish what this paper was trying to accomplish, examining the existing literature and taking that together and interpreting that to come up with some key findings. We also have another eco-driving paper that's currently being put together by Georgia Tech on transit vehicles, so stay tuned for that one. So I think you mentioned, talked about this a little bit, Angela. This is another question that came in. But research on the difference in impacts of feedback systems that are already installed in some of our cars today by OEMs versus aftermarket devices and apps that you can purchase.
Yeah, none to my knowledge, no studies like that.
So that seems like an opportunity as well. So my question to the audience, this is what Ken, threw out there to everyone as well, is, what are some of the research those on the line would like to see? I think a lot of these questions are helping to inform that future research agenda for eco-driving. But, please, if you would like, we invite you to share some of those things that you're really interested in learning more about. One thing that I was curious in coming into this webinar too is that there's this growing critique that cars are becoming there's almost too much technology in cars. And so I've been hearing about and reading some pushback and some encouragement for government to step in there and try to regulate some of these displays. So I was just learning about cars that allow a driver to hook up their phone, sync their phone, and then Twitter will actually cull through and search when they've been mentioned and then display that in the car. So cars are becoming almost this really distracting setting. And so that's what's really, there's this push again for legislators to do something in the space. Because if I'm correct, there's not a lot of regulation currently on in-car displays. And so if there is this growing interest in the government inserting itself, if they're having some regulation on in-car displays, it would seem that we would want to keep those elements that provide helpful feedback. And you're not saying that Twitter mentionings is not helpful feedback, but what kind of feedback that can be communicated to the driver to help them drive more safely, that can help provide financial savings through improved fuel economy, reduce emissions. So in this, I guess, brave new world of in-car displays, it's interesting to think of that role of eco-driving. And I don't know if either of you have, commentary or insights on seeing this evolution of those in-car displays and what does that mean for eco-driving?
Well, no, but I think you've summarized sort of an ongoing set of trends over the last few years. It's certainly going to continue, that as long as we are going to have cars becoming communication centers and display centers for all kinds of information, we want things like eco-driving to be part of that conversation. If we're going to move towards standardization of any of this, you want eco-driving to be part of the conversation. So in some sense, simply elevating the importance of eco-driving to the point where we hear about it on the news as well as hearing about Twitter feeds on the news is probably where we want to be, because we want to be talking about emissions reductions, fuel use reductions, and all the reasons why we privately and socially want those things, in addition to why we want to stay in contact with our celebrity friends while driving.
And I should mention now that the National Center is on Twitter, so if you do want to have a Twitter conversation on this topic, please find us. I think that could be a great way to keep the conversation going as long as you are not driving. That would be great to continue. So we are getting some research suggestions in. These are great. We're going to make note of these. Some of the ones that we're hearing is using data loggers, fleet karma to measure long-term effects of eco-driver training, effectiveness of rebates versus point-of-sale discounts to influence purchase of alternative vehicles. So these are all great topics that we will make note of and hopefully be conducting some more research on this really important topic. So with that, we are a little ending a couple minutes here early, but I think we've covered a lot of ground here. So I want to thank our two speakers today. Angela and Ken, thank you so much for spending your time and sharing the highlights of your white paper. We really appreciate it. And I just would like everyone to know that we will be sending out a follow-up email, so look for that in your inboxes. That will include links to today's presentation, as well as links to the white paper, and I'll also include links to the other eco-driving paper that we do have on trucks. I will also ask that everyone look for that link to take our survey. We really want to hear from you. How did we do? What can we do better? How can we improve the experience for you? Are there other topics or interests that you have that you'd like us to cover? We're very interested in hearing feedback from you. So with that, again, I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you for all those that attended and spent your time with us. And this concludes our webinar for today.